Zethkar pressed his four-clawed fingers against the observation deck's cold metal surface and watched the blue planet slowly spin in the distance. The human homeworld looked peaceful from here, almost innocent in its simple beauty. Small white clouds drifted across brown and green continents while two moons hung nearby like silent guardians. Nothing about this view suggested the inhabitants below were about to face their first real test as a spacefaring species. The Vorthak observer had seen many worlds like this one during his 200 years of military service. Young civilizations always looked so calm before the storm hit them. Most lasted only a few months when faced with a real threat from the galaxy's established powers. The humans would probably be no different. Behind him, the Silent Watcher's bridge hummed with quiet activity. His ship floated in the outer darkness of the Sol system, invisible to human sensors and perfectly positioned to watch everything that was about to unfold. The Vorthak Empire had sent him here for one simple purpose: document how quickly the humans would surrender when faced with overwhelming force. Zethkar's datapad contained everything the galaxy knew about humanity. They had only been traveling between stars for about 300 years, which made them babies compared to civilizations like his own. Their ships were crude metal boxes powered by chemical rockets and primitive fusion engines. Their weapons fired simple projectiles or basic energy beams. Their military tactics followed standard patterns that any first-year academy student could predict. The Kalath swarm had already proven human weakness by taking 12 of their outer colonies in just 2 months. The insectoid raiders were known throughout the galaxy for their brutal efficiency and overwhelming numbers. When the Kalath decided to eat a civilization, that civilization usually had two choices: surrender quickly or die slowly. Most species chose surrender after losing 3 or 4 worlds. It was the smart choice. The Kalath would take some slaves and resources, then move on to easier targets. Fighting them was suicide because their swarm tactics had crushed every military force that had ever tried to resist them. But something strange was happening in human space. Instead of sending diplomatic messages or offering tribute, the humans were doing something that made no sense. They were gathering their fleet for what appeared to be an attack. Zethkar's instruments showed human ships moving throughout their territory in patterns that suggested major military preparation. Civilian vessels were being converted into warships. Research stations were working around the clock on unknown projects. Military communications filled the airwaves with logistics, discussions, and battle planning. The observer shook his head in confusion. Perhaps humans were simply too young to understand how galaxy politics worked. They probably thought their primitive weapons and crude tactics could somehow overcome the Kalath's proven superiority. It would be sad to watch, but educational for the other young species who needed to learn proper behavior. Captain Jake Morrison commanded the human fleet gathering near their outer territories. Zethkar had been monitoring Morrison's communications and found the humans' attitude disturbing. Instead of discussing surrender terms or evacuation plans, Morrison spent his time coordinating attack strategies and reviewing target priorities. The human actually seemed excited about fighting the Kalath. The human fleet itself was a joke by galactic standards. Morrison's flagship was called the UES Defiance, a crude metal box with weapons bolted onto its hull and armor that wouldn't stop a child's toy laser. His supporting ships were even worse: converted freighters, old patrol boats, and experimental vessels that had never seen real combat. The entire force looked like something a scrap dealer might assemble from leftover parts. Against them, the Kalath had positioned over 1,000 battle-tested warships around the human colonies they had already captured. Each Kalath vessel was grown rather than built, with living armor that could repair itself and weapons that fired concentrated acid streams capable of melting through any known material. Their crews were warrior insects, bred specifically for combat, with no fear of death and perfect coordination through pheromone communication. The mathematics were simple: 1,000 proven warships against maybe 300 human vessels of questionable quality. The humans had no chance of victory, and every reason to negotiate, yet their communications showed no interest in peaceful solutions. Zethkar wondered if humans might be suffering from some kind of mental disorder that prevented them from recognizing obvious threats. Other species had shown similar problems. When they first encountered galactic civilization, Usually, one crushing defeat was enough to cure them of such delusions. The Caleth had set up their forward base around a human mining colony called New Colorado. It was perfect bait. The humans would have to attack if they wanted to save the civilians being held there. The Caleth commander probably expected the humans to send a small rescue force that could be easily destroyed as an example to the rest of their species. Instead, Captain Morrison was bringing his entire fleet. Every available human warship was moving toward New Colorado in what appeared to be preparation for a full-scale assault. Zethkar had never seen anything so foolish in all his years of military observation. The human communications revealed another puzzling aspect of their behavior. Instead of the grim determination or fearful resignation that most species showed before hopeless battles, the humans seemed almost eager for the fight. Their messages included jokes, casual conversation, and what appeared to be excitement about testing their weapons against a real enemy. Zethkar made careful notes about this strange psychological profile. Future observers would need to understand that humans might suffer from species-wide combat delusions that prevented them from making rational military decisions. The Caleth were already positioning their swarm in the standard overwhelming assault formation. They would wait for the humans to approach, then launch everything at once in a wave attack that had never failed to break enemy morale within the first few minutes of combat. As Zethkar settled into his observation post to watch humanity's first and probably last major space battle, he felt almost sorry for them. They seemed like a potentially interesting species that might have contributed something useful to galactic civilization if they had been smart enough to surrender when they still had the chance. The human fleet would arrive at New Colorado in approximately 6 hours. By this time tomorrow, Zethkar expected to be filing a report on humanity's unconditional surrender and the beginning of their integration into the Caleth Empire as a slave species. It was a familiar story that had played out hundreds of times throughout galactic history. He had no idea that he was about to witness something that would change everything he thought he knew about warfare. The human fleet arrived at New Colorado exactly when Captain Morrison had promised it would. Zethkar watched through his ship's sensors as 300 human vessels dropped out of faster-than-light travel in what appeared to be a standard defensive formation. The ships looked even more pathetic up close than they had in the intelligence reports. Most were clearly civilian vessels with weapons welded onto their hulls and armor plating that looked like it had been hammered into place by hand. The Caleth swarm responded exactly as Zethkar expected. Over 1,000 insectoid warships moved into their proven attack pattern, a massive wall of living metal and organic weapons that had crushed every enemy they had ever faced. The swarm's coordination was perfect, each ship moving in harmony, with all the others as their pheromone communication system linked them into a single devastating weapon. Captain Morrison's voice crackled across the human communication channels as his fleet approached the enemy formation. Instead of the desperate bravado or grim determination that most species showed before hopeless battles, Morrison sounded almost cheerful. "All right, everyone, let's see what these bugs can do. Remember the plan and watch each other's backs." Zethkar had studied thousands of military engagements throughout his career. He knew exactly what would happen next. The humans would try some basic formation attack. The Caleth would overwhelm them with superior numbers and firepower, and within minutes the human fleet would be scattered wreckage floating in space. What actually happened made no sense at all. The moment the battle began, the human formation simply fell apart. Ships scattered in every direction with no apparent coordination or plan. It looked like complete chaos, the kind of panic that usually meant a fleet was about to be destroyed. But somehow the scattered human vessels were working together more effectively than they had when they were in formation. Lieutenant Amy Parker commanded a small destroyer called the UES Relentless. As the battle started, she broke away from the main fleet and headed straight for an asteroid field near the mining colony. Behind her, a civilian freighter captained by someone named Steve Blake followed her lead. To any reasonable observer, it looked like two ships fleeing the battle in panic. Instead, Parker and Blake were executing some kind of plan that hadn't appeared in any of their intercepted communications. The destroyer began dropping small objects in the asteroid field, while the freighter positioned itself like bait in front of a Caleth attack wing. When 15 enemy ships moved in for what should have been an easy kill, Parker triggered hidden explosives that turned the entire asteroid field into a weapon system. The explosion vaporized the Kalath attack wing instantly. 15 of their best warships simply ceased to exist in a blast that lit up space like a small sun. Zethkar checked his instruments 3 times to make sure he wasn't seeing sensor errors. No military handbook in the galaxy contained tactics like this, but the humans were just getting started. All across the battlefield, similar scenes were playing out as human ships used tactics that shouldn't exist. They turned debris fields into traps, used their own damaged vessels as weapons, and coordinated attacks through methods that Zethkar couldn't even identify. The strangest part was their communications. Most military forces maintained strict radio discipline during combat, limiting chatter to essential tactical information. The humans filled their channels with casual conversation, jokes, personal comments, and emotional support that should have been pure distraction. Instead, it seemed to make them fight more effectively. When the heavy cruiser UES Dakota took critical damage from a Kalath acid stream, Captain Lisa Turner's crew had a choice between abandoning ship and dying with it. In any normal military, the crew would evacuate to preserve trained personnel for future battles. Instead, Turner's people rerouted all power to their weapons and launched one final attack that destroyed 3 enemy vessels before their ship broke apart. As she died, Turner's last transmission was heard across the entire human fleet. "That's for New Colorado, you alien bastards." The effect on human morale was immediate and dramatic. Ships that had been fighting defensively suddenly became aggressive, pressing attacks that should have been suicide runs but somehow worked. Zethkar realized he was watching something that violated every principle of military science he had ever learned. Individual human ships were making tactical decisions in real time, adapting to changing battlefield conditions without waiting for orders from their commanders. They were thinking and fighting as both individuals and as part of a larger whole, in ways that created capabilities no single ship should possess. The Kalath swarm began to falter. Their coordination system worked perfectly when facing predictable enemies who followed established tactical doctrines, but the humans weren't following any doctrines at all. They were improvising, creating new tactics on the spot, and learning from each exchange with frightening speed. When a group of Kalath ships tried their standard pincer movement against a formation of human destroyers, the human ships simply ignored the tactical manual and did something impossible. They accelerated directly toward the enemy center, while firing everything they had, turning what should have been a defensive position into an aggressive assault that scattered the attacking insects. Commander Alex Thompson led a squadron of human fighters in attacks that made Zethkar question his own sanity. Thompson's pilots flew through Kalath formations like they were dancing, weaving between enemy fire while maintaining perfect coordination through what appeared to be pure instinct. When one pilot's ship was damaged, the others instantly adjusted their tactics to compensate, maintaining their assault effectiveness without any apparent communication or planning. The most disturbing aspect of human warfare was how quickly they learned. Each wave of Kalath attacks faced human responses that had evolved from the previous engagement. The humans were analyzing enemy tactics in real time, developing countermeasures during active combat, and sharing new techniques across their entire fleet faster than should be physically possible. After 2 hours of fighting, the impossible had happened. The Kalath swarm, despite overwhelming numerical superiority and proven tactics, was being beaten by a force of converted civilian ships and untested military vessels. 30% of the insectoid fleet had been destroyed or disabled, while the humans had lost less than 20% of their forces. Even more shocking, the human fleet showed no signs of exhaustion or decreased effectiveness. If anything, they seemed to be getting better at fighting as the battle continued. Their tactics were becoming more sophisticated, their coordination more precise, and their attacks more devastating with each passing hour. When the remaining Kalath ships finally began to retreat, Captain Morrison did something that made Zethkar's blood run cold. Instead of claiming victory and tending to his wounded, Morrison immediately ordered a pursuit. The human fleet, damaged, but still aggressive, began chasing the fleeing enemy ships with the clear intention of destroying them completely. As he watched the humans hunt down the retreating Kalath forces, Zethkar began to understand that he wasn't observing a typical military engagement. He was witnessing a completely different approach to warfare, one that treated battle as a learning experience rather than simply a contest of strength. The humans had done more than win their first major space battle. They had demonstrated that everything the galaxy thought it knew about military science might be wrong. 3 days after the battle at New Colorado, Zethkar found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about warfare. The human fleet had not returned to their home territories to celebrate their victory or repair their damage. Instead, they had established a temporary base in the asteroid field, where Lieutenant Parker had destroyed the Kaleth attack wing. And they were doing something that no military force in galactic history had ever attempted. They were studying their enemy. Commander Dan Roberts had arrived with a team of scientists and engineers who were working around the clock to analyze every piece of Kaleth technology they could recover from the battlefield. Instead of simply stripping the wrecks for useful materials, the humans were conducting a comprehensive examination of how their enemies thought, fought, and communicated. Dr. Claire Watson, a scientist who had volunteered for frontline duty, was leading an effort to understand Kaleth biology and psychology. She had somehow convinced several captured Kaleth warriors to participate in her research by offering them medical treatment for their injuries. Zethkar had never heard of anyone trying to negotiate with the insectoid raiders, who were known throughout the galaxy for their single-minded aggression. But Watson had discovered something remarkable: the Kaleth coordination system that made their swarm tactics so effective depended on ultrasonic frequency broadcasts that linked their individual minds into a collective intelligence. Each warrior was essentially a living component in a larger organic computer that could process tactical information and coordinate responses faster than any electronic system. Within hours of Watson's discovery, human engineers led by someone named Ryan Mitchell had modified their ship communication arrays to jam and disrupt the Kaleth frequency broadcasts. They weren't just blocking enemy communications. They were effectively blinding the swarm's collective intelligence and turning their greatest strength into a critical weakness. Zethkar watched in fascination as the humans prepared for their next engagement. The Kaleth had established a major, forward operating base in the Kepler system, surrounded by asteroid mining facilities that provided both resources and defensive positions. Any conventional military force would have attempted a siege or orbital bombardment, following established procedures that had been proven effective over thousands of years of galactic warfare. The humans ignored conventional wisdom completely. Captain Morrison divided his fleet into small teams, each focused on a specific aspect of the coming battle. Some ships carried scientists who would study Kaleth technology during the fight. Others were loaded with engineers who had developed weapons specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in insectoid armor and biology. A third group consisted of fighters and destroyers that would test new tactical approaches against enemy defenses. The assault on the Kaleth base began with something Zethkar had never seen before. Instead of attacking immediately, the humans sent reconnaissance teams to observe and analyze their target for several hours. These weren't simple scouting missions. They were comprehensive intelligence-gathering operations that studied every aspect of Kaleth behavior, technology, and defensive preparations. Sergeant Kelly Foster led a team of Marines who somehow infiltrated the enemy base using captured Kaleth equipment. But they weren't there to plant bombs or rescue prisoners. Foster's team was systematically mapping the facility's layout, studying its defensive systems, and learning how to turn Kaleth infrastructure against itself. When the actual attack began, it unfolded like a carefully orchestrated experiment, rather than a military assault. Each wave of human ships tested different approaches against the base's defenses, gathering data that was immediately shared with the rest of the fleet and incorporated into the next phase of the attack. Commander Alex Thompson's fighter squadron demonstrated the human approach to warfare in its purest form. Instead of following a predetermined attack plan, Thompson's pilots treated each sortie as a learning opportunity. They would probe enemy defenses, test new maneuvers, and share their discoveries with other squadrons in real time. By the fourth attack run, they had developed countermeasures for every defensive system the Kaleth possessed. The base's fall was inevitable once the humans understood how it worked. They had learned to disrupt Kaleth communications, exploit weaknesses in their armor, and predict their tactical responses. More importantly, they had done all of this while fighting, turning active combat into a comprehensive analysis of their enemy's capabilities. But the most disturbing aspect of the human assault was how they treated their captured enemies. Instead of simply executing prisoners or holding them for later exchange, the humans began what they called intelligence cooperation programs. They offered captured Kaleth warriors medical treatment, decent living conditions, and protection from their own kind in exchange for information about swarm organization and tactics. Some of the insectoid prisoners actually accepted these offers. Sethkar had spent decades studying military psychology, and he had never heard of warrior-bred creatures like the Kaleth cooperating with their captors. The humans had somehow found ways to appeal to individual survival instincts that weren't supposed to exist in creatures bred for collective action. This led to the development of what the humans called psychological warfare. Engineer Ray Campbell and his team created devices that broadcast carefully designed signals meant to trigger panic responses in Kaleth warriors. Instead of simply fighting the enemy's weapons and tactics, the humans were attacking their minds and instincts. The results were devastating. When Campbell's psychological warfare systems activated during the base assault, disciplined Kaleth formations began to collapse into individual panic as warriors broke ranks and fled. The collective intelligence that made their swarm tactics so effective became a liability when filled with fear and confusion. Sethkar realized he was witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about how intelligent species conducted warfare. Most civilizations, including his own Vorthak, relied on established doctrines, proven technologies, and predictable strategies that had been refined over centuries of military tradition. Humans treated every battle as a comprehensive research project. They approached warfare with the same experimental mindset they might apply to any scientific problem, forming hypotheses about enemy capabilities, testing their theories under combat conditions, and rapidly implementing improvements based on their results. The Kaleth base fell in 18 hours, but that wasn't the most significant outcome. The humans had captured intact enemy technology, detailed biological samples, and complete intelligence about swarm organization patterns. They weren't just winning battles, they were systematically dismantling their enemies' advantages while building new capabilities of their own. As the human fleet prepared to move to their next target, Sethkar found himself deeply disturbed by what he had observed. The galaxy's established military powers had spent thousands of years developing and refining their approaches to warfare. The humans had learned more about fighting in 3 weeks than most species discovered in 3 centuries. Even more troubling was the speed of their adaptation. Between the battle at New Colorado and the assault on the Kepler base, the human fleet had transformed itself. Their ships now carried hybrid weapon systems that combined human engineering with captured Kaleth technology. Their tactics incorporated lessons learned from studying enemy psychology and biology. Their strategic approach had evolved from simple defensive operations to comprehensive enemy analysis. Sethkar began to suspect that he was documenting something much more significant than humanity's first space war. He might be witnessing the emergence of a completely new form of warfare, one that could potentially revolutionize how conflicts were fought throughout the galaxy. The humans were not just fighting the Kaleth, they were learning them, understanding them, and systematically developing capabilities that would make future resistance impossible. 2 weeks after the fall of the Kaleth forward base, the humans launched what they called Operation Closing Door. Sethkar watched in growing amazement as humanity demonstrated capabilities that shouldn't exist in such a young civilization. The scattered engagements and defensive battles he had observed earlier were nothing compared to what was now unfolding across 7 star systems simultaneously. Admiral Susan Hayes commanded the operation from her flagship, the UES Indomitable, a vessel that had been completely rebuilt during the brief lull between major engagements. The ship that emerged from human shipyards bore little resemblance to the crude metal box that had left Earth's orbital facilities just months earlier. Human engineers had integrated captured Kaleth technology with their own designs, creating hybrid systems that combined the best aspects of both civilizations. But the transformation went far beyond individual ships. The entire human war machine had shifted into what they called total war production. Civilian factories that had once manufactured consumer goods now produced military hardware. Research institutions that had focused on peaceful scientific advancement were developing new weapons and defensive systems. The entire species had reorganized itself around the single goal of understanding and defeating their enemy. Zethkar had studied hundreds of civilizations throughout his career, and he had never seen anything like the speed and efficiency of human industrial adaptation. Most species required years or even decades to transition from peaceful to military production. The humans had accomplished this transformation in a matter of weeks. The fleet that Admiral Hayes commanded reflected this industrial miracle. Hundreds of ships moved through space in perfect coordination, each one representing a fusion of human innovation and captured alien technology. These weren't the converted civilian vessels and experimental prototypes that had fought at New Colorado. They were purpose-built warships designed specifically to exploit every weakness the humans had discovered in their enemies. Captain Maria Santos led a squadron of destroyers that demonstrated the evolution of human tactical thinking. Her ships moved through space with a fluid grace that reminded Zethkar of natural predators, adjusting their formation and approach based on real-time analysis of enemy positions and capabilities. Each vessel operated with complete independence while maintaining perfect strategic coordination with the larger fleet. The humans had also done something that challenged every assumption about how civilized species should treat prisoners of war. Instead of simply holding captured Kaleth warriors for eventual exchange, they had created what they called integration programs. Some enemy prisoners had actually chosen to join human forces, providing intelligence and tactical advice in exchange for protection and decent treatment. This led to another innovation that disturbed Zethkar deeply. The humans had learned to fight on multiple levels simultaneously. While their ships engaged enemy forces with conventional weapons, they were also conducting psychological warfare campaigns designed to break down Kaleth morale and unit cohesion. Engineer Ray Campbell had refined his psychological warfare systems into weapons that could target specific aspects of insectoid psychology. Instead of simple fear responses, these devices could trigger complex behavioral patterns that caused enemy formations to collapse from within. Disciplined swarm attacks dissolved into chaotic individual flight as Kaleth warriors found themselves fighting their own instincts. Colonel Bobby Turner commanded the ground forces that followed up on naval victories, and his approach to warfare was equally disturbing. Instead of simply occupying captured territory, Turner's troops systematically analyzed every aspect of Kaleth infrastructure, learning how their enemies organized logistics, communications, and command structures. The assault on the Kaleth stronghold at Epsilon Station demonstrated human warfare at its most comprehensive. The attack began 3 days before any human ships arrived in the system, as psychological warfare broadcasts triggered widespread panic among the defending forces. By the time Admiral Hayes's fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel, half the enemy garrison had already abandoned their posts. The actual battle unfolded on 7 different levels simultaneously. Human warships engaged enemy vessels with hybrid weapon systems that exploited specific vulnerabilities in Kaleth armor and shielding. Fighter squadrons led by pilots like Commander Beth Clark attacked with tactics that incorporated lessons learned from studying insectoid flight patterns. Ground forces prepared landing operations based on detailed intelligence about enemy psychology and defensive preferences. Most disturbing of all, the humans were fighting an information war that targeted the very foundations of Kaleth civilization. Dr. Watson's research teams had developed a comprehensive understanding of how the insectoid collective intelligence functioned, and they were using this knowledge to introduce chaos and confusion into enemy command systems. Zethkar realized that the humans weren't simply trying to defeat the Kaleth forces. They were systematically dismantling the enemy's ability to function as a coordinated military force. Every engagement provided new intelligence that was immediately shared across the entire human fleet and incorporated into ongoing operations. The coordination between different human forces was unlike anything in galactic military history. Captain Greg Palmer's destroyer squadron worked in perfect harmony with Admiral Hayes's carrier operations, while simultaneously supporting engineer Tony Rodriguez's specialized technology warfare units. They operated as individuals while thinking as a collective, creating emergent capabilities that were greater than the sum of their parts. The humans had also demonstrated something that challenged fundamental assumptions about military logistics. Their supply lines were incredibly short because they had learned to use captured enemy resources to sustain their own operations. Human engineers could analyze Kalath equipment and quickly adapt it for their own use, turning enemy supplies into human advantages. This approach to warfare created a snowball effect that accelerated with each victory. Every Kalath base that fell provided more technology, more intelligence, and more resources that the humans immediately incorporated into their growing capabilities. They weren't just winning battles. They were becoming stronger with each engagement. The psychological impact on the Kalath was devastating. The insectoid raiders had built their entire military philosophy around overwhelming force and inevitable victory. The concept of an enemy that became more dangerous with each battle was something their collective mind couldn't process effectively. As Operation Closing Door progressed, Kalath resistance began to collapse in ways that had nothing to do with military casualties. Entire formations surrendered without fighting when they realized their enemies understood them better than they understood themselves. Others simply fled the battlefield when psychological warfare systems triggered panic, responses they couldn't control. The operation concluded with the complete withdrawal of all Kalath forces from human space. For the first time in their expansionist history, the insectoid swarm had been not just defeated, but systematically broken down and driven away by a force they couldn't comprehend or counter. Zethkar found himself documenting something that would revolutionize galactic understanding of warfare. The humans had demonstrated that military victory wasn't just about superior technology or overwhelming numbers. It was about the ability to learn, adapt, and integrate new knowledge into effective action faster than your enemy could respond. As he prepared his report on Operation Closing Door, Zethkar realized that the galaxy's established military powers were about to face a fundamental challenge to everything they thought they knew about conducting war. The humans had proven that warfare could be approached as applied scientific research, with results that were far more devastating than traditional military doctrine suggested possible. The young species from Earth had become something unprecedented, a military force that grew stronger and more capable with each engagement, learning their enemies faster than those enemies could learn them. The final confrontation between humanity and the Kalath swarm took place at the edge of human space, where the retreating insectoid forces had gathered for what their commanders intended as one last decisive assault. Zethkar positioned his observation vessel at maximum sensor range and watched as the largest Kalath fleet in recorded history assembled for battle. Over 3,000 warships filled the space around a dead star system, carrying millions of warrior insects bred specifically for combat. The human response force numbered fewer than 400 ships. By every conventional measure of military power, the humans faced certain annihilation. The Kalath fleet was 7 times larger and had the advantage of choosing the battlefield. Their collective intelligence had analyzed every human tactic observed during previous engagements and developed countermeasures for each one. The swarm's commanders were confident that overwhelming numerical superiority would finally crush these troublesome primates who had somehow learned to fight. Zethkar prepared to document humanity's final defeat and the end of their brief but remarkable resistance. The mathematics were simple and unavoidable. No amount of tactical innovation or technological adaptation could overcome such massive numerical disadvantage. The humans would be destroyed, and the galaxy would return to its familiar patterns of predictable warfare. Admiral Hayes approached the enemy formation with her usual methodical precision, but something about the human fleet's behavior seemed different. Instead of the aggressive tactics that had characterized their previous engagements, they maintained careful defensive positions while broadcasting something on all frequencies that made Zethkar's sensors spike with confusion. The transmission was being sent not just to human forces but directly to the Kalath swarm itself. Admiral Hayes was speaking in perfectly translated insectoid language, delivering a message that should have been impossible for any alien species to compose. She was systematically listing every tactical weakness, technological vulnerability, and psychological pressure point the humans had identified during months of studying their enemy. It wasn't a threat or a demand for surrender. It was a comprehensive demonstration of how completely the humans understood their opponents. Hayes described Calith organizational structures in detail that suggested her people knew more about insectoid society than the insects themselves did. She outlined psychological profiles of individual Calith commanders and predicted their tactical responses with terrifying accuracy. The effect on the enemy fleet was immediate and catastrophic. For a species that had built its entire military philosophy around collective superiority and overwhelming force, the realization that their opponents understood them better than they understood themselves created a crisis that their collective intelligence couldn't process. Doubt and hesitation spread through the swarm like a virus. Individual Calith warriors began questioning orders and tactical decisions that had seemed obvious moments before. The collective mind that had made them so effective in previous battles became a liability as confusion and uncertainty propagated through their communication networks. Then the humans demonstrated why they were truly dangerous. The battle began with Admiral Hayes's flagship launching what appeared to be a conventional missile attack against the enemy center. But as the weapons approached their targets, they revealed themselves to be something entirely new. Each missile carried a psychological warfare payload that broadcast specific frequency patterns designed to trigger maximum panic in insectoid nervous systems. The result was chaos on a scale that Zethkar had never witnessed. Entire sections of the Calith formation broke apart as individual warriors abandoned their posts and fled in random directions. The collective intelligence that had coordinated their movements for thousands of years simply collapsed under the weight of artificially induced terror. But the humans weren't finished. As the enemy formation dissolved into confusion, every ship in the human fleet demonstrated the tactical independence that had made them so effective in previous battles. Captain Greg Palmer's destroyer executed maneuvers that supported Admiral Hayes's carrier operations while simultaneously coordinating with Commander Beth Clark's fighter squadrons and Engineer Tony Rodriguez's specialized warfare vessels. Each human ship operated with complete autonomy while maintaining perfect strategic coordination with the larger fleet. They adapted to changing battlefield conditions in real time, supporting each other through tactical innovations that emerged organically during the fight. This wasn't military discipline or training. It was a fundamental characteristic of how humans approached complex problems. Zethkar realized he was watching something that violated basic assumptions about how intelligent beings could coordinate large-scale activities. The humans were functioning as both individuals and as a collective simultaneously, creating capabilities that were greater than the sum of their parts, while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to unexpected situations. The Calith swarm, despite overwhelming numerical superiority, began to fragment as human forces systematically exploited every weakness identified during months of comprehensive study. Psychological warfare campaigns caused entire formations to break ranks before they had suffered significant casualties. Technological countermeasures neutralized weapon systems that had been proven effective for centuries. Tactical innovations confused enemy commanders who had prepared for human behaviors observed in previous battles. As the battle progressed, something unprecedented happened. Large sections of the Calith fleet simply stopped fighting and began retreating without orders from their commanders. The psychological impact of facing an enemy that understood them so completely had broken their will to resist. Admiral Hayes could have pursued and destroyed the fleeing enemy forces, but instead, she did something that demonstrated the fundamental difference between human and conventional approaches to warfare. She allowed the Calith survivors to escape, while broadcasting a final message that would be remembered throughout galactic history. "We have studied you completely," Hayes transmitted to the retreating swarm. "We understand your biology, your psychology, your technology, and your tactical preferences better than you do. Any future conflict between our species will end the same way, but faster. Choose your next actions carefully." As Zethkar compiled his final report on the human-Calith conflict, he found himself documenting conclusions that would revolutionize galactic military thinking. The humans had demonstrated something that challenged every assumption about how warfare should be conducted. They approached each enemy not as an obstacle to overcome through superior force, but as a problem to solve. Through comprehensive analysis and systematic application of scientific methods, every battle became a learning experience that advanced their understanding of warfare, technology, psychology, and strategy. Unlike other species that relied on established military traditions, humans treated warfare as applied research. They formed hypotheses about enemy capabilities, tested their theories under combat conditions, analyzed results, and implemented improvements continuously. This made them uniquely adaptable and increasingly dangerous with each engagement. Most importantly, humans waged war with their entire civilization, not just their military forces. Scientists became weapons developers, engineers became tactical, innovators and civilian industries became military production systems. The entire species transformed itself to meet existential threats with a speed and efficiency that defied galactic norms. Zethkar's final observation would shape diplomatic policy throughout the galaxy for generations to come. He wrote, "Humanity should never be fought. They should be allied with, traded with, or avoided entirely. But they should never, under any circumstances, be considered defeatable in military conflict. They learn too quickly, adapt too readily, and fight too completely. Any species that chooses war with humanity will find itself not just defeated, but comprehensively understood and systematically dismantled." The report concluded with a recommendation that all galactic powers immediately begin diplomatic overtures toward establishing formal alliances with humanity, rather than risking future conflicts with this remarkable and terrifying species. As his ship departed the battlefield where the Kaleth Empire had suffered its first and final defeat, Zethkar looked back at the blue planet where it all began. The humans had proven that intelligence, adaptability, and the willingness to learn could overcome any advantage in numbers or technology. They had shown the galaxy a new way of thinking about warfare that would change everything. The age of predictable military conflict was over. The age of humanity had begun.